Hello, sisters, and it is lovely to be talking with you today. I'm going to be talking today with a radical feminist from India, and she says that she seeks to promote radical feminist ideas by any means possible. She has chosen what I think is a really, really, really good choice, the book Intercourse by Andrea Dworkin, which was published by Secker and Warburg in 1987. So I'm first of all just going to give a bit about Andrea Dworkin's background, and then we'll start talking about the book. And many of you who are in our audience are probably very, very familiar with Andrea Dworkin's life and work, as she is probably the most important of radical feminist theorists. But for those who aren't, I'm going to give a few details. I remember very well when this book came out. I'd been actively involved in feminism for about 16 years at the time. And at that time, new works by radical feminist theorists were waited for with huge anticipation. And there were a lot of marvelous books coming out in the 1980s. I wasn't really aware of Dworkin's work until the publication of, which I think is probably her most important book, Pornography, Men Possessing Women, in 1981. She had written two earlier books, Woman Hating, which included an excellent critique of harmful beauty practices in 1974, and Our Blood in 1976. But these were not very well known in the UK, and I didn't read them until after the publication of Pornography in 1981. Her book, Pornography, was not the only radical feminist writing on pornography, but I think it was the best, and it established her reputation. And I was involved in anti-pornography activism at the time, from the late 80s and into the 1980s, and her book was very important to us. I didn't hear her speak until a conference it called The Sexual Liberals and the Attack on Feminism in the US. So I have a letter from her from 1985 in which she comments on the importance of my work on the history of sexuality and sexology in particular. So I'm very proud to have that letter in my archives. And she references that work of mine, which was obviously familiar with, in Intercourse. She was the towering figure of radical feminism in the 1980s. And whenever I heard her speak, and I was lucky enough to do so several times, I was, like everyone else, impressed by the sheer power of her oratory. No one else had her passion. She provided a wonderful shoutline for my book Anti-Climax, which was published in 1990. I did not get to know her, though, until the late 1990s. I'm sorry to say, when I was able to meet up with her and have serious conversations in Vancouver and New York. After Pornography, she wrote several other books, notably Right-Wing Women in 1983, which is a mistrustful analysis of why women might be attracted to right-wing politics, and then Intercourse in 1987. Two wonderful collections of her writings and speeches were published, Letters from a War Zone in 1989 and Life and Death in 1997. Her last two books were a book on the connections between anti-Semitism and the oppression of women, called Scapegoat in 2000, and a memoir, Heartbreak, in 2002. She died in 2005 of heart problems at the age of only 58, and many, many feminists were distressed by her death. Her rhetoric, the extraordinary facility with words which she showed in expressing the profundity of the oppression of women, is unsurpassed today, I would suggest. So I'm now going to ask some questions about the book, and I'll reply to some of them myself and so on. Why did you choose Intercourse? I'm going to show the book now. It's a very strange cover. I think it's probably bed sheets, which may have something to do with Intercourse, but it is a bit of a puzzle. So why did you choose Intercourse, and why do you think it's important to discuss it?
Like you said, I always admired Dworkin's raw anger and her courage to call a spade a spade. The mainstream discourse on sexual intercourse, it doesn't challenge the very circumstances under which intercourse happens between women and men. The mainstream feminism of today, it stops at asking for consent. That's it. But what intercourse does is that it dares to think about the sex act itself. It dares to think about the very nature of the act, the circumstances under which women get fucked, and at one point also the content of the act itself, and what it means for women, because the current discourse, it's not women centric whenever sexual freedom and sexual liberation is being talked about. We want to talk about consent, we want to talk about ask your partner what makes them what they want, but the idea is that it has such meaning for women, because so many women because so many women they suffer from from being subjected to sex that they don't want. So I think it's very important to read this book and to talk about it, because women should not cede the political ground to men, so that they can continue to define what intercourse is and what it means and what sexual liberation means. So that's why I think that this book it's a revelation, because Dworkin is very focused, yet she's holistic, as in she refers to art, religion, legend, myth, fiction, and she unpacks every aspect of it. She asks all the questions. And what she reveals is that intercourse is a consequence as well as a cause of women's inequality. So that's why I think it's very important to read this book and to talk about it.
I think it's great that you, as a much younger woman than me, are really starting to think about sexual intercourse and what it means for the oppression of women in this way, and coming back to this book. I mean, I really think this conversation needs to happen. So it's terrific to see your interest in this. Now, I want to ask you, when you first read the book, and at what stage in your feminist career did you read it? Because, of course, you are younger than me. You will have read it at a different time. And did it influence you? And if so, why?
Yes. So I read it over the course of last year. I have been a radical feminist for the past 4 years, since 2017. But I read it last year. And the book has definitely influenced me a lot, in that it has deepened my resolve to continue to fight against the male sex right, to continue for the fight of the abolition of male sex right by organizing against pornography, prostitution, and the rough sex defense as it is. I was familiar with many tenets of radical feminism when I started the book, but then I just realized porn culture is everywhere, and lies spewed by men about women and what intercourse means for us are also everywhere. But then this book just sort of put everything into perspective, and it just makes it hits you like a train. It makes you realize the sheer extent to which women suffer, and how it influenced me was that intercourse is considered to be as an indicator of personal freedom and liberation. But what Dworkin does is that she has a very sobering effect on this thought. She puts everything into perspective, and she says, well, and after you read the book, you get the impression that perhaps not. It's not an index of how liberated or how free women are. For all that, it shows how oppressed women are. So that's how it influenced me, and that's how it's just made me even more radical than before.
And I'm so glad this book is there for young women to read now. Back when it came out in 1987, it wasn't, and when I read it, because it was published in the UK, it wasn't a surprise, because radical and revolutionary feminists like myself had been developing an analysis of sexuality up to that time. So really it confirmed what we thought, and we were pleased to see it in her wonderful language. But it wasn't surprising. The difference, I think, now is that there isn't that conversation for you to be in. There's no discussion of sexual intercourse out there at all until you find this book. In these webinars, we find that often many of those in the audience have not read the book. And so they don't actually know anything about what's in it. So I think it's important for us to try and give a good overview. And so, you've said a little bit about it. It would be good if you could say more about what the book's about. And I think then we have put in different sections that we're going to talk about in more detail. But if you could just give more of an overview of the book now.
So the book is divided into different chapters. There are 3 parts to the book. So in the first part, Dworkin, she starts with philosophizing about intercourse and about the nature of intercourse. Okay, so throughout the book, what she's done is she's used different devices. She has used fiction, let's say Tolstoy's Clujo Sonata, or she's used metaphor, or she's referred to legend, to historical figures like Joan of Arc, to to sort of put her critique together. These are examples which she uses to build her point, as she does towards the later chapters. She first makes her points and then she refers to various examples, be it secular law, be it the Old Testament. So it begins with Dworkin thinking about the nature of sex, what it means to men and women. So if for example, men are repulsed by women, but then they are obsessed with fucking up. Towards her later chapter, she gets very political. How sexual intercourse is it's a metaphor for the occupation, for the invasion, for the colonization of women's bodies. How she has done it is that it's not like at the end of each chapter she's giving a way forward, but she's building towards it. So possession and law are two important. I mean, they're two very important chapters. Though I insist that read the whole book, sit and take time out and read the whole book. But what she's saying in possession specifically is that for women, possession and intercourse are synonymous. Fucking is an act of ownership, and she gives very graphic examples of the same. So what she says is that under male supremacy, intercourse is an act of possession. Men penetrate our bodies, and thereby they come to have ownership of it. Men have owned women as chattel in our role as wives, prostitutes, reproductive servants like the surrogates of the modern day, or slaves. So what she says is that women's sensual experience and what women can get out of sexual intercourse is limited by this act of possession and the feelings and the obsession that drives it. Under male supremacy, it is not the man who is seen as the one possessed. He's literally inside her body and her muscles are holding on to it. And what she says is that, this male terror of being captured and being inside a woman's body has driven men to slaughter women and burn them at the stake for centuries altogether. Despite this male terror, men do come to possess us. Men do fuck us. So long as male supremacy is there, intercourse would be an act of possession, would be an act of men controlling women. And as for law, what she says is mainly that she sees law as an instrument of keeping and protecting male supremacy. So long as the man's right over women to fuck women and to fuck them however he pleases is protected, the law will not interfere. And she says that intercourse is anything but a private act. Now, in our contemporary discourse, people want less and less state regulation of intercourse. But that is not how Dworkin sees it. Dworkin says that men do make laws against, say, rape or sexual harassment and, sexual offenses mainly to avoid intra-male conflict, to avoid one man on trespassing on the property of another. I mean, when you read this chapter, it may come across pessimistic to you, but then it is what it is.
I'll just talk about a couple of the other chapters, because it's really, I think, the chapters at the end of the book, as you said earlier, that really give the details of the politics and lay them out. Then the first section of the book's got a lot of literary criticism, so it's not direct. So one of the chapters is called Occupation, and I do think this is a very important chapter. And as you just said, what she points out is that sexual intercourse takes place in a political context, and it's crazy to imagine that it doesn't. But of course, that political context is never mentioned in all of the great art and literature and so on. Nobody ever mentions there's anything political about sex. It's considered completely natural, completely biological, and so on. But she says, intercourse takes place in a context of a power relation that is pervasive and incontrovertible. And she says about the occupation of women in sexual intercourse by men, that physically, the woman in intercourse is a space inhabited, a literal territory occupied literally. Occupied even if there has been no resistance and no force. That act occupies a woman's body. And I think that's really, really important, because there's all this discussion about how important women's bodily integrity is. How can a woman have bodily integrity when her body is regularly entered? I mean, that's just the situation. Ordinary sex is the regular entry into a woman's body, and yet we never talk about that contradiction between bodily integrity. Men have bodily integrity. Women, as long as sexual intercourse exists, cannot. And of course, an issue that she never talks about in the book is the fact that a product of sexual intercourse is babies. Babies occupy women's bodies as fetuses. Women can never be individuals, as some feminist theorists say, because sometimes they are two. So women's relationship to her body because of sexual intercourse is completely different from any idea of how a man might relate to her body. When I teach about sexual intercourse, or did so, I explained that it was not good for women's bodies, but absolutely compulsory, as she points out. And in my new book, Penile Imperialism, I'm talking about how it is absolutely compulsory. Women may not be interested in sexual use by a man, but they may have to. But they may want companionship, they may be poor, they may want to have children, they might want to seek social approval, and so on. So for all kinds of reasons, they're involved in sexual intercourse, which they absolutely do not want to do. And I've got a lot of that in my new book, showing that women really don't want to, are often disgusted, horrified, really don't want to engage in sexual intercourse, and yet nothing of that is ever heard. It's as if this is a wonderful experience in the culture. It is, of course, the only reproductive sexual act, so it requires the technologizing of the female body with hormonal or barrier contraception, which is often harmful, and nobody talks about that fact. It's as if it's natural that women should have to do all of these things to their bodies, whereas actually there's more pleasure in doing other things. And she does talk about sheer heights research from back in the 1980s, which showed that only 70% of women at that time had orgasms during sexual intercourse. Can you imagine a compulsory sexual practice for men in which they didn't have orgasms? I mean, it's difficult to imagine that happening. It's the only sexual practice which routinely spreads sexually transmitted diseases, for instance, and women have to often sort of technologize themselves against that. It usually takes place in a male superior, female inferior position, so the very position of sexual intercourse is a problem. I mean, these are the things that I've tended to say about sexual intercourse, not necessarily what she's saying, but I think they do fit with it. So sexual intercourse is a strange practice to take place if it's not about pleasure and it leads to babies that people don't want and so on, but it is absolutely compulsory. Now, what she explains in this book is that in order for sexual intercourse to take place, something happens before it, and that thing is what she calls objectification. And objectification was something that feminists talked about very much at the time. And one of the ways she says that happens is that women engage in harmful beauty practices. They make themselves into objects. They, of course, do depilation. They wear high-heeled shoes. They put on makeup. They make themselves into objects. And then it is possible to use them. And she says, to become the object, she takes herself and transforms herself into a thing. All freedoms are diminished, and she is caged. Even in the cage, docile, sometimes physically maimed, movement is limited. She physically becomes the thing he wants to fuck. And of course, the highest point of culture right now is women in impossibly high-heeled shoes, so they simply cannot walk. Politicians, all sorts of women are in this situation. So they are fuckable. They've been made objects. And in fact, you've probably seen already on social media that The Lancet, the medical journal, this weekend published an edition in which it referred to women in an article on wanting to end problems with menstruation. Women are referred to as bodies with vaginas, so totally objectified. And she talks about the effect of intercourse on women, saying when intercourse exists and is experienced under conditions of force, fear, and inequality, it destroys in women the will to political freedom. It destroys the love of freedom itself. And of course, that's a question we never asked. What does it do if women are regularly penetrated all of their lives in this way? What does that do to how they can think, how they can think politically, how they can experience freedom? And I think she speaks wonderfully about that. And then the final chapter of the book is entitled Dirt Death. And it deals with the way in which the inferiority of women is symbolized by what is seen as the dirt and the filthiness of her genitals. She has a wonderful section on inferiority and what it feels like, which I think we all need to think about, because that is the situation of women inferiority. And we don't often talk about how does it feel our whole lives. And she says, the deep and destructive devaluing of a person in life, a shredding of dignity and self-respect, an imposed exile from human worth and human recognition, the forced alienation of a person from even the possibility of wholeness or internal integrity. And of course, internal integrity she cannot have if she is regularly penetrated.
So the question that she's asking is incredibly difficult. How can women have physical integrity? How can women have self-determination when there is a, she says, when there's a slit between her legs? She can be penetrated, she can be entered, she can be occupied. I mean, it's so her integrity is always going to be lesser. It's always going to be less significant. Yeah, because she has this slit between her legs, and it which men can, must, and do enter, as she says. So, I mean, this is the most difficult question. It's the most uncomfortable question, and it's a question that is not being asked. The discourse around sexual freedom and sexual liberation is just not on.
And she talks about the fact that women's genitals are seen as extremely filthy by everybody, sexologists and scientists and great Christian divines and male novelists and so on. Women's genitals are seen as disgusting, associated with menstrual blood, with shit, whereas male genitals, of course, are seen as perfect and the Godhead and absolutely wonderful and nothing dirty about them. So in order for men to constantly penetrate women, they have to get through what they see as absolute filth. Yeah. And indeed, in penile imperialism, I do look at how the so-called perversion might come from this. Men have to overcome terrible filth as they see it to engage in sex at all. So sex is filthy for them and women are filthy. And she talks about the sexologists saying that women smell like fish. And of course, gay men talk about women as fish. In RuPaul's Drag Race, women are fish, and they're talked about in this way because they're seen as absolutely stinky. So yes, how sexual intercourse happens when women are so filthy and seen by men as so filthy is an interesting question.
What she's saying in her chapter on dirt and filth, attitudes, opinions, are not going to change the fact that the system predicated on women, or seeing women as dirt and filth, changes. So that's very relevant for the modern day discourse.
Women's periods being seen as shameful and absolutely filthy, of course, is still absolutely there. And it's happening when little boys are being allowed into girls' toilets at schools because of the demands of trans activists, and the little girls are having to suffer the shame.
Just before we continue, where the chapter on occupation and collaboration, where she says the God who does not exist made her so that she can be penetrated, she has a slit. I was just thinking about gender identity when I was reading it. And, the way trans identified men, whenever they describe their experiences, it just took my mind back to those paragraphs. And, it just feels like gender identity is such an extension of the same logic of men occupying and, penetrating women, because it's almost like as if because she has a slit between her legs, you can just tear her apart and wear her like a costume.
In the Dirt and Death chapter, she has a lot on the way in which Black women and racially oppressed women are seen as filthy, particularly filthy. So Black women are seen as doubly filthy. There's a filth about race, and there's a filth about their genitals. And she has a lot of extraordinary detail in that chapter on all of that. Do you like the way that the book is written? Because it is not like anything else, really.
So the earlier chapters, I did find myself, reading paragraphs again where she's using metaphor, and when she's using, there's a heavy use of metaphor in her earlier chapters. But I mean, overall, I like the way it is written. It's not a book for someone if you're looking for, okay, so there are all these problems in this world. Let me find a solution to how intercourse can be made equal and pleasurable for women. That's like, if that's the mindset that you're approaching the book with that. The book is that's not what it is for you. She has a very holistic approach, and one of the reasons that I also liked it was that when most people, most people accuse radical feminists of ignoring race, of ignoring class, but if you read the whole book, all of those things are there. Race is definitely there. So she's able to focus on intercourse, and yet she's able to connect all the multiple problems, the other issues that women face, and to put them together. I like the way it was written. Though earlier chapters can be admittedly a bit difficult to understand.
Because they're very much about literary criticism. All of the books by men that she talks about, I have read before I became a feminist, because I've only read books by women since I became a feminist. It can be a bit off-putting, the early chapters. So I would say to women, if you're having any trouble with the early chapters, go straight to the later chapters. When I first read the book, I got a bit put off by those early chapters. What do we think is the very main core message of the book?
Intercourse between women and men. It happens under a context of male supremacy. It happens under a context where men have political, social, economic power over women. And so intercourse between women and men is not equal. It's not an act which can be understood in isolation by isolating all the other kinds of oppressions that women face. So that's one message. It tells you that intercourse is not exactly that exalted, the end goal of freedom and liberation. No, it's this uncomfortable truth that men fuck women under a context of oppression and inequality and subjugation. How do we get self-determination for women with intercourse being what it is? So the main takeaway from the book is that, women are fucking men under a context of inequality and oppression. That's the context we have. We're not free. We're not equal.
I think these paragraphs really sum up what she's saying in the book. She says, there is no analogue anywhere among subordinated groups of people to this experience of being made for intercourse, for penetration, entry, occupation. There is no analogue in occupied countries or in dominated races or in imprisoned dissidents or in colonialized cultures or in the submission of children to adults or in the atrocities that have marked the 20th century, ranging from Auschwitz to the Gulag. There is nothing exactly the same. And that is not because the political invasion and significance of intercourse is banal up against these other hierarchies and brutalities. Intercourse is a particular reality for women as an inferior class, and it has in it, as part of it, violation of boundaries, taking over, occupation, destruction of privacy, all of which are constructed to be normal and also fundamental to continuing human existence. And I think this is really, really important, because in a lot of sort of equal opportunities politics, there's race, sex and class, disability and so on. It's all run together. Diversity covers just about everything, for instance. There is no consideration of what is very, very, very specific to the oppression of women and makes the oppression of women completely, completely different from the oppression of other groups. And as she said, not necessarily more serious, but very, very different. And in the book, she doesn't talk about the product of sexual intercourse. As I said, she doesn't talk about the fact that women have children, which also makes their oppression totally, totally different as well. But I guess that would be another whole book, but that is connected to sexual intercourse, of course. And all of this makes the situation of women completely different. So to try and discuss it in terms of diversity and equal opportunities and so on really makes no sense. And she says here, the political meaning of intercourse for women is the fundamental question of feminism and freedom. Can an occupied people, physically occupied, internally invaded, be free? Can those with a metaphysically compromised privacy have self-determination? Can those with a biologically based physical integrity have self-respect? So I think that these are questions feminists don't ask themselves. I think because maybe they're too frightening. for feminists actually to think about what this means for women, our actual the biological invasion of women and what happens as a consequence of that. So really that is not discussed.
Mainstream feminism stops at asking for consent and equal opportunities. I mean, I also, I see women around myself who manage to get to the top of all these male-run institutions, say companies or parliaments or whatever. But when you read this book, you realize a human being who does not have this, this basic currency of self-determination. So no matter how equal opportunity women get in male-run institutions, this question, until answered, the problem will still remain.
She says what intercourse is for women and what it does to women's identity, privacy, self-respect, self-determination, and integrity are forbidden questions. And yet, how can a radical or any other woman who wants freedom not ask precisely these questions? The quality of the sensation or the need for a man or the desire for love, these are not answers to questions of freedom. They are diversions into complicity and ignorance. And I think, indeed, the only questions we're allowed to ask around sexual intercourse as women generally is how to get better orgasms or how to have any kind of sexual sensation. There's massive advice. There's the whole profession of sexology, which is trying to design women or make women have the right response to this thing, which very many do not wish to do. But there's never any asking of the question of what does it actually do to women? What is the effect on women? And I like the second part of this quotation, the quality of the sensation, the need for a man, or so on. These are the sort of things that women say as to why they do it. But Dworkin does not accept that they are sufficient. They aren't answers to questions of freedom. The big question is it compatible with freedom? And she says here, intercourse is a loyalty test, and we're not supposed to tell the truth unless it complements and upholds the dominant male ethos on sex. So women are simply not allowed to say that they don't want to do sexual intercourse, they don't like sexual intercourse, they don't have any response to sexual intercourse makes them feel bad. Intercourse is indeed a loyalty test. I can remember when I appeared on a talk show. There's a bit of me online talking in Dublin on a talk show back in 1990 when Anticlimax came out. And the Taoiseach's mistress, who was on the panel, kept crossing and uncrossing her legs and said, "I love fucking." So she desperately needed to do the loyalty test as soon as I was there because feminism was going to be discussed and criticism of sexual intercourse in this program. So it's you hear women doing it all the time. I've been on other panels and other places where women just say, "I love it, I love it, I want more of it, I want more of it, I want more of it." An extraordinary thing, because the more they say they want more of it, the more loyal they are to being invaded, being occupied under male supremacy. Back in the 1970s, there were many heterosexual feminists. I became a lesbian at that time, so it didn't affect me so much. But there were many heterosexual feminists who gave up penis in vagina sexual intercourse. They didn't want to use the contraception. They didn't generally think it was very relevant to pleasure, and they gave it up. And there were discussions and women gave it up. I can't imagine that happening now because it simply cannot be questioned. We're not in a time period when sexual intercourse can be questioned, but we were very radical back in the 70s. I'm just trying to think about how the book has been regarded. On the cover, there's a shoutline from Germaine Greer, which says, "The most shocking book any feminist has yet written." And on the back cover, it goes on to say, "It forces us all to ask ourselves if we have not been deliberately ignoring the obvious." And that was being said in 1987. And it seems to me we are still deliberately ignoring the obvious. But it was a very shocking book at the time. Lots of people say, "She couldn't have said that." She seems to be saying that sexual intercourse isn't good and maybe we should give it up and maybe it shouldn't be happening so much. So that was terribly, terribly shocking, I think, at the time. And that was why she was saying it was so shocking. So I think that leads us on to another question, really, which is whether we think that sexual intercourse is irredeemable, and whether in this book she's offering any hope of that. Now, I have to say, from reading the book, I don't think she's offering hope. every so often, she has a little tiny paragraph where she says there could be some kind of change around it, but it's so much a second thought. I really don't think she is offering hope that sexual intercourse can somehow be made different. I mean, another one of the things that was talked about in the 70s and 80s was maybe the language could be changed so that instead of a man penetrating a woman, it could be a woman engulfing a man or whatever. So if we change the language, will it look different? And I think it certainly didn't make a difference. I don't think changing the language makes a difference. Do you think that there is any form of societal change that could change sexual intercourse? And if so, what would that be to make it redeemable?
It seems like there is no way forward that she's offering. But then, like I said, she explicitly says that change of attitude or opinion is not going to change the system. So I do think that, that our fight for the abolition of the male sex right, that is prostitution and pornography and rough sex, and of course beauty practices and objectification also included. If we fight against these practices and these institutions, I think that kind of change that does offer us some way forward. It's not exactly a way forward, but she talks about an alternative model that was given by Victoria Woodhull, which is called the female, which she calls the female first model of intercourse, wherein she said that Woodhull recognized that the very nature of the act, that is physical penetration and occupation, it makes women vulnerable to violation. Hence, women should have the incontrovertible, the first say in choosing their sexual partners and in determining the nature and the act of sexual intercourse. What implicitly I derived from her chapter on the chapter virginity, where she's talking about Joan of Arc at length, that she seems to be endorsing some kind of separatism from men. Virginity for her means refusing to be compromised by men by engaging in the male supremacist fuck. So I mean, if we were to talk about what kind of societal change she wants to see, I think it's towards the abolition of the male sex right. Of course, it's very easy to take away from the book that it's irredeemable. Nothing can be done about it.
Of course, what you're talking about is how we change the nature and the symbolism around the act, if that were indeed possible. But the other possibility is if women want to have sexual relations with men of any kind, then they should not be including the act of sexual intercourse, because that's particularly problematic in all of the ways that we've been talking about. And it's not directed to women's sexual pleasure. I mean, we know it isn't, because, of course, lesbians don't do that and have perfectly happy sexual relationships with each other without doing this practice. So that practice is certainly not a necessary practice. The interesting thing is that, as you say, she's talking about the Victoria Woodhull analysis, but also talking about maybe being more separate from men. But she lived with a man. She lived with a gay man and continued to call herself a lesbian in the last 30 years or so of her life, which, 20 years of her life, which has been very, very puzzling. And of course, lots of women have asked about how does all that she say relate to being in this relationship with a man. I will leave that there for the moment. In the book, in terms of language, Dworkin uses the term gender. And that was a really big surprise to me, because radical feminists that I knew, and certainly I at the time, not use the word gender at all. And I'm sure she didn't in her earlier books, though I haven't gone back to look. So it shows that there was a change taking place. She talks about gender hierarchy, and in other places she uses the word gender, where I would have said at that time, and still do, sex. And was that a surprise to you? Did you notice that? And were you surprised by it?
Yes, I did notice that. I was a little surprised by it. But, I would be more surprised if a contemporary radical feminist were to do the same, as in use the word gender where she should be using the word sex. It didn't bother me a lot, because radical feminists were the first ones to emphasize on the importance of the gender-sex distinction. It's not something that has stuck with me after the book. But yeah, I mean, if a contemporary radical feminist were to do that, I would certainly be very surprised.
It shows how in the 1980s that language was coming through and being used. Now, the book was published in 1987. Do you think it would be even more shocking today if it was coming out now, and if anybody noticed or picked it up, which they might? How do you think people and how do you think readers would react to it now?
I think it'll be as shocking. See, her unabashed political as well as moral commentary on an act that people are just continually saying, oh, this is private. Like, it's not a place to talk about it. It's private. Let it be. Let people do what they want to do. It depends on the individual. When someone comes along and gives such strong political and moral commentary on something that people want to be as neutral about and as private about as possible, it's definitely going to make many people uncomfortable, and it's definitely going to make people think, oh, she doesn't know what she's talking about. I was reading a book on ethics a few years back, and there was a reference to her, the common mistake that people make, that Dworkin said that all sex is rape.
No, and you're absolutely right that the main thing that's said about the book is she says all sex is rape, with just an extraordinary misrepresentation of what she was doing. Now, do you think that now the situation has changed in relation to heterosexual sex? And what has changed now? Is the book still relevant to what's going on? Is it still describing what's happening?
Yes, I think it's describing what's happening, because since 1987, men have devised more ways to possess and own and invade women. One of them is, of course, gender identity, which to me is the exact metaphor for tearing a woman apart and just getting into her and wearing her like a costume. So gender identity, sex dolls, legalization of prostitution in various countries. So I think that this book, it's urgently relevant. And when it comes to heterosexuality and the culture around it, I mean, the kind of things that men do to get to fuck women, it ranges from small lies to like outright attack and rape. And deception in heterosexuality is, I think it's severely underrated. I mean, it's not talked about. It's still seen as a cute, innocent way in which shy and insecure men get sexual access to women. It's just an example that I'm giving, but these are the kind of circumstances under which women get fucked by men. It happens to our bodies. It happens to our health. Our lives depend on it, given the rise of the rough sex defense. So I think the situation since 1987 has been that men have come up with more ways, and the defense of these acts have also multiplied the same. So if a woman were to come along and say, hey, there's this book which says that all of this is not liberation, this is not freedom, this is a cause and a consequence of inequality and oppression of women, the backlash, I think, is going to be massive. The backlash is massive.
And I think that obviously in 1987 there was no internet. The development of pornography as an industry has totally changed the playing field, as has the development of sadomasochism as an industry as well, because there's there's huge amounts of money in sadomasochism, and that is what I write about in Penile Imperialism. So we are in the situation where men now occupy and possess women in a different way. For young women, anal sex is absolutely compulsory pretty much now. So there is another orifice and another form of possession. Somebody in the chat says, I would love to hear your thoughts on Catholic intercourse only for procreation versus feminist intercourse only for procreation. Well, it's true to say that when I used to teach about this, I did used to say that sexual intercourse, penis and vagina sexual intercourse, is a reproductive act. And if a heterosexual couple really wants to reproduce, then perhaps it could be done ceremonially with candles and so on, not necessarily for the pleasure of it, because it might not be so, and so on, but surrounded by a ceremony simply for the purpose of reproduction. Yes, that could sound a bit like, I suppose, a Catholic approach. Although, of course, the Catholics think it should happen all of the time and there should never be protection, and so there can be reproduction all the time. I don't know whether that answers that question.
How would you position the sex positivity feminism and the rising sex negativity trend within the framework laid out in Intercourse? So she's saying there's a sex positivity feminism, and then there's an actual sex negativity trend. How does that link up?
It's a bit complicated, but I think back in the 1980s, of course, there were the feminist sex wars, and those of us who were criticizing the construction of sexuality and the politics of sexuality were totally opposed by those who said they were sex positive, and we were seen as sex negative. We were positioned as anti-sex for wishing to criticize and say anything about sex. So that actually defeated feminism. Sex positivity, which was we love it, we love it, we love it, please do it, do it, do it, do it now, defeated us. I mean, it was a very sort of pornographic, pro-pornographic feminism in a way. I don't know whether that's what the question was about. I mean, what's happening now, I think, is that there is some sex negativity. I mean, I've read articles about how pornography is actually turning young people off sex, and there's young people deciding they jolly well aren't going to do that. But I don't know much about that. I can't say anymore. Do you have anything to say about that?
Dworkin does say that, okay, so liberals refuse to even so much as inquire that there is a relationship between intercourse and the oppression of women, and radicals think that, well, that's what God made it like, that's how it is. What I think is that women should continue to ask what are the circumstances under which they are getting fucked, and will basically not cede the ground, not cede the political ground for men to determine the circumstances under which they get sexual access to us, be it marriage, be it casual sex, be it BDSM, be it rough sex, whatever it is. So, sex positivity versus negativity seems like a very, very narrow way of looking at it. I would look for values like mutuality, reciprocity, and self-determination.
The question that we need to ask is how women can have companionship and love in their lives without necessarily having sex at all if they don't wish to, and without having to become lesbians if they do not wish to, and so on. So it should be possible to have lives without sex, and I think that's something that there could be a new movement around. I think there is a new movement around, in fact.
Just one question about rough sex. Someone's asked that in the chat. So rough sex defense is something that has recently come up in the common law in the common law jurisdiction of England and Wales. There were a few cases in America as well. It's basically situations wherein men have basically ended up killing their sexual partners during the act of sexual intercourse because those acts involved choking or really aggressive acts which put the lives of the women in danger, and they died during the act as a result of the act. So if you want to know more about it, you can read Rakel's piece on Feminist Current about it. But then what these men do is that when it goes to the court, they take the defense saying that, well, she consented to the sex act. It's like saying she consented to be killed. It doesn't make any sense to me. It sounds ridiculous to me. But that's the kind of defense they are taking, and I think that's it should be very confusing to liberals, because so long as consent is there, that's the only desired standard that everyone is fighting for. That okay, she consented to die, she consented to be choked until she died. So that's the rough sex defense,
and that is the struggle of the moment.